This is our fourth class talking about hymnody, and we're going to focus tonight on Charles Wesley mostly. We'll talk a little bit about John, but Charles was really the prolific hymn writer of the two of them. From the numbers that I've seen about John wrote about somewhere between 55 and 100-ish hymns in his lifetime. Charles Wesley wrote 8,989 hymns. So they credit him with almost 9,000. So he definitely was the more prolific of the two writers. Charles Wesley lived from 1707 to 1788. He was one of 15 children. 10 of their children only lived through part of their infancy, so that not all of them lived to be adults, but and then his mother was one of 25 children, so they definitely had a lot of kids. Now it's interesting because I said to you last week that Isaac Watts is known as the father of English hymnody, and some people also give Charles this designation. A lot of people say, though, that he actually more deserves the title the father of Methodist hymn singing, that his influence in really getting his congregants, the people that came to hear him preach to sing, or to hear him and his brother preach when they did it together, was really the mark that he left. Even though he wrote a lot of hymns, that it was really kind of how he encouraged people to sing that was more important. And of course, we know both the Wesleys as fathers of the Methodist Church. Just like Isaac Watts, we talked about last week that Isaac Watts was a dissenter, and that his father also was a dissenter. Well, Wesley also, his father and grandfather were dissenters from the Anglican Church. And we remember that the dissenters were, kind of like Martin Luther was trying to, with his 95 Theses, trying to kind of point out things he didn't like about the Catholic Church. There was definitely a group of people known as dissenters from the Anglican Church. The interesting thing is most of them were just fined for not going to the Anglican Church, kind of like given a tax. But then some of them, especially the ministers, were put in jail often. And we do know that just like Isaac Watts's father was in jail a number of times, that Samuel Wesley, the father of John and Charles, also spent time in jail. For Charles, his mother was a huge influence on him. She was a very huge lover of languages. She taught her sons Latin, Hebrew, Greek, and English at very young ages. She expected them at the age of 5 to learn the entire alphabet of each of those languages, each in one day. She homeschooled them at a young age, and she would require them to learn one of those alphabets one day at a time, which was quite impressive that she was able to force them to do that, but she figured out how to do it. She also was a huge lover of poetry, and so a lot of people credit his mother as being a huge influence on his ability and use of language. Well, the interesting thing about Charles as a dissenter, and John as well, is that they broke the rules a little bit differently. They didn't break the rules by starting their own church or being a pastor in a dissenter church. They broke the rules of both the dissenting churches and the Anglican churches by deciding that they weren't going to preach inside the walls of a church, that they thought that you should go out to the people. And so that's really why they stood out, and in some ways were dissenters even of the dissenting churches because of that. And as I said, he wrote quite a number of hymns. I think that's on the next slide. Hold on. No, it's not. Did I? Oh, yes, that's right. So I want to talk about a couple more things. No, that's it. Sorry, I lied. This is a picture of John and Charles, John on the left and Charles on the right. The Methodist Church has put together a little 4-minute video that focuses on the Wesley brothers. So I thought I would, and their contributions to Hymnody. So I thought we would watch just a short video on them.
He is Methodism's most famous musician, and his words have inspired people of faith for nearly 300 years.
6,000 hymns. Charles Wesley is the poet laureate and great writer of Methodism. So many of Charles' hymns talks about the liberation of the human soul. In the hymn we love to sing, "Oh, for 1,000 tongues," he breaks the power of canceled sin. He sets the prisoner free. Jesus, the name that charms our fear. He not only helps us sing our theology, but he helps us to understand what it is we really have to sing about and belt out with joy and inspiration.
Charles Wesley left his mark on Methodism, a movement very much influenced by its music.
Our theology is something that we've sung, and we've sung it in a way to help us understand it and to help us feel and experience it at the same time. So it's one thing for me to say, for example, incarnational theology. It's another thing for me to say, "Hark the herald angels sing, glory to the newborn King."
Early Methodists took their hymnals home during the week, and hymns became daily devotions.
They'd use it as a little, what's called a little mini dictionary. If someone wanted to know about how to pray to God, there was a hymn for that. If someone wanted to know, gee, what does it mean that Jesus is divine? There was a hymn for that.
Born in 1707, 4 years after his brother John, Charles was the more creative force, and John the organizer.
Charles' influence on John was every bit as great as John's influence on Charles. In these two brothers is a wonderful dynamic duo that really give us the heart and soul of Methodism.
It was Charles's desire for a deepened religious experience that led them to form a holy club while Charles was a student at Oxford. And Charles had his conversion experience before his brother.
We all know John's story of the heart strangely warmed, Aldersgate Day, May 24th. But guess what? Charles' heartwarming experience was May 21st.
Charles Wesley's faith was most clearly communicated through the thousands of songs he composed. His words are known worldwide, and United Methodists can take pride in their connection to this poet and preacher.
Being a Methodist, I like to think of the feast, the potluck, where all the churches gather in community. What do we bring to that feast? And for Methodists, it's song. At Easter time, not just Methodists, but Christians around the world sing, "Christ the Lord is risen today." And at Christmas time, churches around the world sing, "Hark the herald angels sing." Even Charlie Brown sings it. That's our gift.
All right, so just a little bit of background, and I'll be kind of building on that background just a little bit more as we go through. So as Charles was going to school, we know that he did his bachelor's degree at the Westminster School. The interesting thing about the Westminster School at this period is that the Westminster School did all of their studies in Latin. So none of it was in English. You were required even to speak Latin in the university grounds. And then he did his master's at Oxford. One of the things that the video talked a little bit about was that while he was at Oxford, he started something called a Holy Club. His brother was also a member of this Holy Club. the interesting thing is that this club was started as a group of people who got together, who wanted to take communion together, who wanted to do Bible studies, and even did missions. It was a very popular thing for them to even go into prisons and to feed people and to do mission work. During this time period, he also developed a lot of his kind of skill with rhyme and poetry, but he did not actually write any hymns up to this point that we know of. It was mostly just kind of general poetry and that sort of thing. But as he graduated from Oxford, he became an ordained minister of the Anglican Church in 1735. And so did his brother John, and they were immediately sent by the church to be missionaries in the Americas. They spent a lot of time on the East Coast, Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina area. Most people describe their mission work in the Americas as a fairly large failure. They were not successful, at least for whatever goals was set forward for them by the church. And so they only stayed about a year and a half, and then went back to England. But their time in America introduced them to the Moravian Church. Now, I don't know a whole lot about the Moravian Church, but what I have learned is that at this point, the Moravian Church was music was a very large part of worship for the Moravian Church, and their experience with the Moravian Church and the music was quite influential. The Moravian Church was one of the first churches to include instrumental music in their worship, which, if you remember a little bit of our conversation of the history of hymnody, there was quite a large argument in the 18th century about whether instruments belonged in the church, and whether, you know, the Bible verses that name instruments really deemed it okay for us to have instruments in the church. Just like there was arguments about the kind of singing and the style of singing, there was also arguments about instruments, you know, the type of instruments. These conversations are not new to just praise music conversations. They have been around for centuries. So it was really influential that they experienced this very kind of boisterous, music-centered worship, which was not the kind of worship they would have had at the Anglican Church. The Anglican Church, even though it was not Catholic, would have still maintained quite a lot of the kind of singing style and the music style of a lot of the Catholic Church, just because that's what they knew. And even though Isaac Watts had brought in hymns, those hymns were still mostly based on psalms and that sort of thing. But what Charles did was he experienced this boisterous, very passionate music of the Moravian Church, and it really changed him. The other thing about the Moravian Church was he came to know a gentleman in the Moravian Church. I'm guessing he was a worship leader of some sort, possibly a pastor. And this gentleman, he was having a conversation with him about the fact that they were not being successful in their mission in the Americas. And this gentleman asked him or had a conversation with him about, do you believe that your success is dependent for you to experience salvation? And Charles responded, yes, I think so. And this gentleman said to him, the grace of God is available to everyone, no matter what you do, no matter how successful you are at what you do. The grace of God is there and present and is open to everyone. And this was a really big deal, and this really led to what we know as the conversion of of Charles Wesley. And that conversion also led to him writing his first hymn, which we think was right around the same time as his conversion. And that hymn was called While Midnight Shades the Earth O'erspread, which is a very interesting long title, but I was easily able to find the text for his first hymn, and this is it. While midnight shades the earth o'erspread and veil the bosom of the deep, nature reclines her weary head, and care respires, and sorrows sleep. My soul still aims at nobler rest, aspiring to her Saviour's breast. Aid me, ye hovering spirits near, angels and ministers of grace, whoever while you guard us here, behold your heavenly Father's face, gently my raptured soul convey to regions of eternal day. Fain would I leave this earth below of pain and sin, the dark abode, where shadowy joy or solid woe allures or tears me from my God, doubtful and insecure of bliss, since death alone confirms me his. Till then, to sorrow born I sigh and gasp and languish after home. Upward I send my streaming eye, expecting till the bridegroom come. Come quickly, Lord, thy own receive. Now let me see thy face and live. Absent from thee, my exiled soul, deep in a fleshy dungeon groans. Around me clouds of darkness roll, and laboring silence speaks my moans. Come quickly, Lord, thy face display, and look my midnight into day. Error and sin and death are o'er. If thou reverse the creature's doom, sad Rachel weeps her loss no more. If thou, the God, the Savior, come, of thee possessed, in thee we prove the light, the life, the heaven of love.
What tune is that sung to, Tim?
There was a tune assigned to it in the hymnal that I looked at, but it was not a tune that I know. Let's see. Midnight shades the earth o'erspread. So that's 8, and veil the bosom of the deep. So it's 8888, which is long meter, I think. So we would have a number of tunes, but I did not recognize the tune that was with this. I tried to sing it. Sorry. I'll go back and look again, but I'm pretty sure it wasn't one we knew. Now, I do also want to point out that Charles did not write any of the tunes. And if you go through our hymnal and look at the tunes, the hymns that we have of his in our hymnal, some of the tunes were written way before he wrote the text, and some were written way after, and some of them have no date with them. So there's a mixture of ones that have been assigned tunes after the fact of him writing, some that maybe he wrote specifically for a tune, but he did not write the tune. But what we really see in this is a number of things. We see him working out some theological stuff and trying to really kind of see what is God and how does God deal in sin? How does God deal with dark moments of our lives when we feel like we are not maybe meeting up to what we believe we should be? We also see that he is a poet, that his texts are so poetic, to the point that in order to really understand any of these stanzas, we'd have to read it through a few times and really kind of delve into the poetry quite a bit deeper. I don't think that all of his tunes, all of his hymns are maybe as densely poetic as this one, in that you can't figure out pretty quickly in some of them what you're saying, but I still think that we really see this this use of words in a very, very poetic and theologically metaphorical way. Oh shoot, there was something else I wanted to say and now it went out of my head. I'll think of it in a minute. But I just thought you'd find it interesting to read his first hymn, which we believe was written around the same time as his conversion. We know and hear a lot about John Wesley's conversion, but we don't hear as much about Charles's. John Wesley started to then take his brother's texts and help him to form a hymnal. And one of the the first hymn in that hymnal came from a poem that he wrote called "For the Anniversary Day of One's Conversion." And the 18 stanzas of this poem, the seventh stanza is, "Oh, for 1,000 tongues to sing my dear Redeemer's praise, the glories of my God and King, the triumphs of his grace." And what's very interesting about this is we, of course, know this hymn, is that it was the first hymn in the first book of poems or hymns that the Methodist brothers published. And it was called A Collection of Hymns for the Use of the People Called Methodists. And its first printing was in London in 1780. The other very interesting thing is that we have maintained this text being the very first hymn in our hymnal ever since then. That every Methodist hymnal that has been printed has kept "Oh, for 1,000 tongues to sing" as the first hymn in its hymnal, including the current one that we have now. Now, not including all the versions of it, we don't have, but it is the first also in the green hymnal, the worship and song. It's a new arrangement, but the same text. So I thought that was interesting that that it definitely became important. Over the next decades, Charles Wesley would pour forth an avalanche of verse, often intensely personal, always profoundly biblical, usually poetically masterful. And one of the most important kind of things is that he breaks away from the Psalms completely. If you look at any of his texts and try to find a connection to the Psalms, I'm not saying there wouldn't be any, but the majority of his texts do not come from Psalms. For example, this text was inspired by the gentleman from the Moravian Church that helped to lead him to his conversion, and that the original quote from that gentleman was, "If I had 1,000 tongues, I would use it to sing to my God." And he used that statement from this gentleman and created this hymn, although this wasn't the first stanza of the hymn, but still he used it to make this part of the verse. So there definitely was something that inspired him to write this text, but it wasn't a psalm. The other thing that the brothers, as they started to write these psalms and publish them, realized was that this was, as you heard in the video, a really important way that they could help people to experience theology, and again, we're talking about, you know, in a lot of ways, baby Christians, right? People who, even from the Anglican Church, still do not have, a way to really talk about and express and think about their theology and what they believe. And so they really saw these hymns as important ways to talk about this. As we look at the current hymnal, this is literally a picture that I took from our current hymnal. I wanted you to see we have 51 hymns by Charles Wesley in our hymnal, starting with 57, which is for 1,000 tongues, and going all the way to 718. There are also, what's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 poems, and then another 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 responses. So we've included texts that are not meant to be sung also in our hymn book. In contrast, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of John Wesley's hymns. Again, text is all he wrote, and then tunes from someone else. But we even have one of Samuel Wesley's hymns. Samuel Wesley was the father. And we have one hymn by him, and then we have one of their other brother, who is lesser known of the other two, but was also a minister and a text writer of hymns. And we have 4 of Samuel Sebastian Wesley, also known as Samuel Wesley Jr.'s hymns. So it's just very interesting to see. Actually, looking at those dates, there's no way that's the brother. So that must be a son of one of the two. There was a Samuel Jr., but now that I look at those dates, that's got to be a Samuel the third. So that's probably one of the two Charles or John's brothers. Sons. But they did have a brother named Samuel as well. But now that I look at that there's with those dates, there's no way that's. It's no way. It's got to be a grandson. Anyway. But you can see the Wesley family had a lot of contributions to our current hymnal. So I decided we would take a look at "Oh, for a Thousand Tongues to Sing." Now, we talked a little bit about, as we were looking at hymns and looking at the music, we talked a little bit about that stepwise movement was really important, but there are also some really essential leaps that happen in hymns, and we see this at the very beginning of this hymn. So in this hymn, we are in the key of G, but the very first note is D. But we know that if we're starting on G and Do is G, that Do, Re, Mi, Fa, So, the D is the So, okay? And to start on So and leap to Do is a really great way. We oftentimes end with that at the end of a piece, but it's also a great way to start something and to kind of give a leap of energy kind of to the piece. And so we start with this. So, do, do, re, re, mi, re, do. And then we're back to more repeated notes and stepwise movements. Then we go re, mi, mi, fa, mi, re. Then we go jump up to that so, mi, do, la, la. So, I say do, la, so, do, re, do. So that's the solfege for the melody that we're working with. So we have this exciting so to do jump, oh for a thousand, and that immediately lets us know that this tune at least is a tune that has a majestic kind of sense to it. That so to do is often used in fanfares for the king. It would be something that would definitely set apart for the people that have the ear of this kind of time period, that something majestic is happening in this text. Just a little bit on the background of the person who wrote the melody. Sorry, I've got to find it in my notes. Give me 1 second. Oh, come on. So Carl Glaser, who lived from 1784 to 1829, wrote this tune, and the tune is known as Asmon. I don't know where that name comes from. Remember, a lot of the tune names came from where they wrote the tune, but I don't know if there's a place named Asmon or if he dedicated it to a person's name. But Glaser was a German composer and a contemporary of Beethoven. And although Charles Wesley's text we know had been sung to a number of tunes throughout the years, this is now the dominant tune that it is sung to in traditional hymnals. A couple other things that's really interesting to look at in the text. So as I said, Wesley employs this text or this saying that Peter Buller, the Moravian missionary that he met, said, "Had I 1,000 tongues, I would praise God with them all." But it says, to further heighten the emotional nature of the poem, Wesley punctuates words like Jesus and the last words of phrases with an exclamation point. You'll see triumphs of his grace, exclamation point. It doesn't look like a lot of the exclamation points may be carried through in all this, but there's also originally 18 verses, so they might be looking at some. Other poetic devices used to express the incredible nature of salvation include the oxymorons present in stanza 6. Hear him, ye deaf, his praise ye dumb, your loosened tongues employ. Ye blind, behold your Savior come, and leap ye lame for joy. Now, a lot of people struggle with this verse because they believe to say to a deaf person, hear God, or to a person who can't speak. First of all, calling somebody dumb that can't speak is not a word we use now, but we know for a fact from his writing and from the contextual nature of this text that he's not speaking to people who are literally or physically deaf, dumb. What he believes is that human beings without the grace of God are deaf, dumb, unable to speak, unable to see, unable to move. That he sees that grace is what brings us the ability to see and hear and understand and move. And so it is metaphorically used, not literally. Let's see, I'm just trying to make sure I get all my notes that I wanted to talk about. I think that's everything. So, any thoughts about the text and the music and how that fits in this version of this?
Tim, if I could just say one thing.
Yes.
It's just amazing that the two Wesleys, especially Charles Wesley only was here a little bit of time, and yet they had such an influence on America, on frontier America, and early in our history. It's quite amazing that it happened. And by the way, I have an aunt who's probably written more hymns than these guys. She's very, very religious, and she'll get up in the morning and she says, "I've got another hymn." And
wow.
I went to visit her in 2014. She should be 99 now. I hope she's still around. She's my last sibling of my parents. But she has a beautiful voice and still had one at the age of 93. But she would come inspired in the morning, and she'd have another hymn all written down, and she'd sing it to us. It was always the same tune, but she'd sing it to us.
So she'd write different words to the same tune every time.
Yes.
Interesting.
I was taking a class on religious music, church music at CU, and he was an organist that taught it. So one of our tests, we had this whole list of hymns, but it wasn't from the words. It was the music that we had to know the names of these hymns. It was the most awful test I ever took in my life, because I could hear words with it, all of them, and I had to learn each individual hymn by a different name, depending on who wrote the music. And I'm sure I only remembered it for 1 week after I got through the test, because not being an organist, that was not as important to me as the words were. But that's the way I had to learn a lot of these hymns.
Yeah, and that's hard when you know a lot of, when I hear a tune, I can think about sometimes 2 or 3 texts that go along with that tune. Yeah. Jim, just to add to it, so someone actually did the math in the Methodist Church and said that in order to write the number of hymns he did, he would have had to have written at least 10 stanzas of poetry a day in his lifetime. I'm guessing they're not counting his childhood, but basically when he was adult and started writing. But he would have had to have done 10 stanzas a day in order to just be as prolific as he was. I thought that was interesting.
Yes.
So now I thought we'd do 2 things. I thought we would take a moment to sing through the version of "Oh for a Thousand" that we know. We have been also singing one by Mark Miller in our parking lot worship, and we started singing it before parking lot worship when Pastor Eric was here, because he happened to be a big fan of the version. But anyway, I thought we'd sing the traditional version, but also listen to a little bit of the Mark Miller version and talk about how does it change the text when you hear the same text, or when you sing the same text with a different tune. So first, let's sing along. If you'll turn off your microphones again for me, because when you start to sing with the microphones on, you're not at the same place that I am and that the music is. But we'll sing through. This is the same organist from last week from Grace Community Church in California. All right, so that was the version that we are used to. And now let's, you don't have to sing along with this one if you don't know the tune, because it doesn't unfortunately have the words or the music up on this video. But I wanted you to listen to just a couple of verses of the Mark Miller version and just talk a little bit about what is it, as you're listening to it, how does it change your perception of the text? How does it change how you experience these words when you hear it in a completely different, much more contemporary setting of this hymn? All right, so I'm going to stop sharing now because that was the end of that. But let's talk for a minute. So how does that, how do you experience that text differently when you hear it with that music?
I think that, go ahead.
It seems much more uplifting.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have that majesticness to it, but it has this energy and excitement to it. What about you, Jim?
I just think that I enjoy the tunes even better than the words in any of these. If so, they just build a spirit, a mission, emotional thing that those endorphins get to flowing that the words alone cannot do the job. And that's what I feel from it. When we were singing earlier, that reminded me of all the times I would on Sunday evening go to my grandparents' house, and Aunt Dorothy, I talked about, played the piano, and we all sang, and that was some of the stuff we got.
Well, I think this is something the Wesley brothers really understood, and I haven't talked about this yet, but remember I said at the very beginning that he really is given the credit for developing singing in the church. And one of the things, as we know from just the front of our hymnal, the rules of singing that are placed by the Wesley brothers there, they believe that singing should be an experience. It should be joyful. It should be community. They understood the power of teaching about God and grace and love with music, and that was such an important part of their ministry. And so they really got that, and I think it's really important that we understand that didn't happen prior to the two of them. That is something that has both given the Methodist Church a reputation of being a place that has really great music, that the music is an important part of worship. But beyond that, it also really changed kind of the face of church in the 1800s.
I guess I'm just old enough to be traditional enough that I can appreciate the new upbeat stuff. But for something like that song, I've got to stay traditional with what's the majestic that I've known forever and ever.
Sure. And I mean, I have mixed emotions, because when I think of the triumphs of God's grace, the triumphs of God's grace, that feels way more like that text. But I'm at the same time with Pat, I love that, the energy, oh, for 1,000 tongues, there's something really energetic about it. So I think they both have a place. I think that they help us to see and feel different parts of the text as well.
By the way, Tim, we have another Frisch that's joined us.
I see, yes.
Yeah.
What?
There's a fourth Frisch.
Really is a fourth one.
Hi, Jake. We're glad you're joining us.
Can't unmute us there.
I'm usually around, just not visible.
Ah, the invisible man.
The background Frisch.
Awesome. Well, we're glad you're joining in visibility today. Awesome. Any other thoughts about? I'm just going to keep doing this to help you understand and kind of to help us continue to explore what different tunes do, and just what is typical and what are things that we can see in as trends in hymns and how those kind of affect things. Any other thoughts about Charles Wesley or Oh, for 1,000 Tongues or any of that?
Tim, I think it would be interesting sometime if we ever get back in church and singing that during a service we did both of those versions for the congregations to try.
So one of the things we're definitely looking at playing with a little bit is how we can mix some of the traditional and the new, because there are definitely some people who really liked some of the new hymns that we did during parking lot worship. And so I think there's ways that we can do that. So I think that's a great idea, Katie.
Yeah, well, I wasn't one of those people that like, you mean the praise stuff?
Yes.
I mean, I'll sing it and stuff, but it's not like this song. Like he took this song and made it interesting. And I think some of the praise music is just very repetitive. And
we did three. We did this one, which was a traditional hymn that we updated because Mark Miller has done this arrangement. And then I did two others. All Creatures of Our God and King was one of them that we did over our time. And that was a Fernando Ortega arrangement. He's a Hispanic composer in the church. And then I also did an arrangement of his of Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing. So we did 3 updated. Now those 2 used the original melody, but updated the feel and the rhythms and things of it. So we did actually do that with a couple of, with 3 of them. So I was trying to find all of those mixtures and experience that. And I know
I just think though, in the parking lot services, I bet you most people listen to you instead of singing like we would in church.
I will
But
say there
maybe
were
not.
a lot of people that had their phones out that I could see their mouths moving in their cars.
Good.
Yeah. I've actually heard people are less inclined to sing on the pre-recorded that they watch at home because they don't want to just sing by themselves at home. They miss that community aspect. So I encourage you to sing whenever, because I think it's important. But I think it's hard. There is something to be said for the community that is created, and I think we will all appreciate that more when we come back together. I remember about 3 years ago, we did a hymn sing, and I brought in a story and read it as part of the service of a missionary who was coming back from, I think it was Africa. And although he loved his time in Africa, he said the thing he missed the most was singing traditional hymns. And what he meant by traditional was ones that he knew from his childhood, and singing them with Americans, just simply because it was other people who knew that. The hymns that he sang in Africa were African hymns in African languages. And although they maybe used a few tunes, they had their own tunes that they had set some of these texts to. And so he just talked about the minute he came back and sang the tunes that he was raised with, how it just kind of overwhelmed him. And I think that's going to be an experience that we'll all kind of experience again once we are in a building together singing again. So
the importance of music, and it doesn't matter what faith or your religion is. When my mother was in a nursing home for the last 10 years of her life, and I used to take her down to the community room and I'd play hymns, and pretty soon I'd have a room full of people sitting there listening. And you'd start Amazing Grace, How Great Thou Art, Blessed Assurance, and they'd all wake up and they knew every word. And then they'd go back to sleep until I'd hit another song that they all knew. But how important it was, to let that be a part of their life when I was there, to enrich them in that way. I was glad I could do that.
Well, and just think for a moment, in the 1500s and the 1600s, at least the early 1600s, people weren't allowed to sing. You sat in church and you listened to the monks, you listened to the choir sing, you listened to the cantor. And so for this major shift, that really now we understand how important this ability to sing songs and sing things that we know, they really got it. And so I think it's a reminder for me always when I look at both the development of music and the development of music in worship. It's a reminder to me that although I go in there and talk to you about solfege, and we talk about, look how there's a leap here and a stepwise movement, and it seems very scientific, and, Tim's going off on his math lesson again. But so none of that came out of, some scientist sitting down at a board and trying to work things out. It came out of the fact that people started singing together, and then somebody figured out, well, we should probably write this down. It's all human intuition. It's all human nature. Singing and music is built into our DNA. And I think that the people who created the church, I think the people of the biblical times understood this. And I do believe that God understands this, that music is truly a part of creation. So anyway, yes.
Can I ask you one question? Being a history teacher again, it seems like that we were talking about that there was not so much participatory singing and all, but out on the whole Tocqueville concept of frontier America seemed to be embodying this whole new concept of singing and participation.
So I think that mostly comes that the Reformation happened right around the same time that you're seeing colonizing starting to become important. And
Yes.
so I think that what we understand is the majority of people that came over to America were leaving because they didn't like the fact that either the Catholic or the Anglican Church were trying to control everything, right? And so the majority of people that came to America were probably more Protestants. I mean, we understand that just from the Pilgrims and that sort of thing. And so they're definitely bringing this idea over, and music just became an important thing of expressing story and everything. And again, it was such a part of human nature, and it was a part of human nature that was no longer being kind of tamped down or controlled. And so I think we see it kind of explode in America too. That would be my explanation, not a historically accurate one, but that would be my explanation.
I think that in the early, not in the early church, but in not colonial America, but as we began to move to the West, that this became very, very important. I had a great, we think, grandfather who was a singing schoolmaster that went from church to church. He would spend a week in a church and then get back on his horse with his folding little organ and his books and go to another church. And they would stay for a week, staying in different houses, and they would sing every night for the whole week. Then he would move on and leave, hoping that they would be singing these songs when he left, even though he was not there. And that would have been probably in Indiana, Illinois, and Kentucky that he would be working at that time.
Well, and we know that this Moravian church that so influenced Charles was in America, was in the Americas. And the Moravian church definitely found music to be extremely important. And so that had to have affected, but they also understood the importance of music. I mean, when your goal as a missionary or as a minister is to bring people to the faith, to grow the church, and you figure out music is a great way to engage people and to help teach that theology in a way that seems like they can understand it or feel it or experience it better, you're going to use that tool, and so I do believe that there also was an importance of that for people like that gentleman who were going around, because they believed they were bringing salvation to the people they were talking to, because that was, of course, a very important part even for the Wesleys. So
one thing I wanted to say
was,
excuse me, when we first came to this land, we ran into the Native Americans, and Native American music was everything to their lives. If they were celebrating, if they were grieving, if they were going out to hunt, anything, it was always music before and after.
Yeah, and it was collective. Again, it was the group, right?
Together. Yeah.
Yes, in a circle.
Absolutely.
You always have your circle.
And we can definitely, just looking at the history of music, unfortunately, we know that a lot of the Native Americans were not treated well, but we can know that that their music still did affect the development of music in early America. And that it played a large part, especially the rhythms, the drums, the percussion rhythms, was really an important effect on the development of American music and the kind of style that started to come alive in that time. So unfortunately, they were not treated well, but their music was still influential into developing what we have today.
Thank you.
Sure. Awesome. So lots of really cool stuff with Charles Wesley. Hopefully you learned something new. The most important thing of everything that I read was that the people who write about him say that he doesn't get enough credit for a lot of times people say, well, John developed the Methodist Church and Charles wrote the hymns. And they say that's not really the case, that Charles was as influential and oftentimes went off on his own and was a preacher of his own right, and held outside services just like his brother did by himself in many places. So they wanted you to know that he was just as influential and important to the development of the Methodist Church as John was, even though John is seen as a little bit more of the organizer because he was really good at getting people to do things. So, all right. So next week we'll have a little conversation about texts, and we'll continue to delve into this idea of theology. I thought this was a good time to have this conversation. We were talking about it in the last kind of 2 classes about how some of us struggle with some of the theology of the hymns, and I think that that's exactly, you know, a great conversation for us at AUMC, where we don't expect everybody to believe and think and feel the same way about theology and things, but because the Wesleys, I mean, not that it wasn't the truth for the others, but the Wesleys were really writing texts that were not just about reiterating a biblical scripture, but about really bringing theology alive. I thought it would be a great time to stop and have that conversation next week about theology and text and how we can kind of find ways to look at these texts in different ways. So we'll have that conversation, and then the following week we will jump to the most prolific hymn writer of all history, except for possibly Jim's aunt, Fanny Crosby, who also happens to be a woman. So I really want to spend a moment giving her some credit, because we don't get as many female hymn writers as we do male, at least in the early days of hymn writing. So we'll spend some time with Fanny after that. So next week will be Pastor Amy, and then the following week we will do Fanny.